Well, howdy, folks. Welcome back to another special edition of the Left in Texas podcast. And this, we are interviewing candidates for Congressional District 10, which
Right.
spans from suburban Houston all the way to Austin. We actually have two really great candidates in there facing off in the runoff. One is Mike Siegel. He is a civil rights lawyer. He actually previously ran in this race and made it quite competitive. And
Right.
that's why there's a lot more interest in this race now. But he's a former public school teacher with Teach for America, AmeriCorps, National Civil Service Program. He's been a city of Austin attorney and represented lawsuits. One in particular, he got quite a bit of notoriety from, which was the lawsuit against the Secretary of State that banned local governments from setting up temporary polling locations. He got a lot of news around that, and it was actually a very good fight that he put up, and one of the few victories we've seen for Democrats. His opponent in this race is Dr. Pritesh Gandhi. He
Right.
is first generation American, Houston born. His father, he himself is a primary care doctor for underserved and uninsured individuals. His background, he did his residency partly in New Orleans, where he organized around gun violence and other social determinants of health. He also worked with the working poor in Boston, focusing on nutrition. We spoke a little bit about what it's like to campaign during a pandemic, especially as a doctor, and how
Yeah.
his profession has sort of allowed him to sort of rise to the occasion during this time, and how he's also been volunteering during the protest as a doctor. And we talked a little bit about how things have been going for him and what's inspired him to run. So very very interesting race. Two different candidates, both very progressive.
Right.
But it's just good that we're starting to see this kind of competition really for Democrats, like we have really never seen before.
Yeah. We're blessed. It's a kind of a difficult blessing when you have to choose, between matchups of really, high quality people to put up against these very well entrenched, but lately, sort of slightly more vulnerable incumbents. Mike, I think to the wonkier of us who have been paying attention on a kind of a longer term basis, is a fresher name, obviously, because of all the things that you said. He's just fresh off of a very successful run that he came very, very close to winning. And that when he did that, he was, at least at that scale, was a bit of a new name. And so he's performed well, and it's nice to see him back. I think of MJ, and I think of Julie Oliver, and I think of other people who kind of made their bones in that most recent election, who are still kicking, and gladly so, because they're solid candidates. I do think that I wonder how much it's really going to play, but I've said this a couple of times that I think anybody who represents science or represents the medical field right now, there's a certain degree of credibility, at least with part of the electorate, that those people have a little bit of maybe a little bit of an advantage. Now that many of us are placing a bit more credence and value on those of us who are true experts in those fields, and they're so badly needed to get us out of the pandemic and all that. So I think that would probably be to his advantage. But I think again, this is a difficult choice. I haven't made my mind up, which I would prefer. I can't vote in this particular race, but I'm not sure who I would vote for here. Both really solid and quality candidates.
Excellent. Okay. Well, let's just start by learning a little bit about you. I know you're a Houston native. It looks like you've spent time all over the country doing all kinds of pretty incredible things, working with low income populations in Boston, and then moving to New Orleans. Can you talk about your personal and professional path?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a incredible journey over these last couple of decades since I originally left Texas. I left after high school. I'm born and raised in Houston. My mother and father are both immigrants here. My mother, actually, her story is interesting in that she escaped political violence in East Austin, in East Africa. So she was born and raised in Zanzibar, and island off the coast of Tanzania. And there was violence when she was living there as a child, moved to Uganda. Uganda at the time had a dictator, Idi Amin, and that dictator kicked out many South Asian families, and my mother's family was one of those families. And so, lucky for my mother was able to make it to the U.S. U.S. offered a visa to my mom to get here, and that's how we got our start in Houston. For me, my entire life has been driven by public service. So as you may know, I'm the Associate Chief Medical Officer of a federally qualified health center here in Austin. So we serve about 20,000 uninsured and underinsured Central Texans, just a crazy number if you just think about the scope of the work. And this desire to work in this setting has been driven by what I've done most of my adult life. In Boston, my background actually was in economics and international affairs, but after a pivotal year for me as a Fulbright scholar, I was working in a landfill in Bombay on access to clean water. I realized then that for so many of us that are advocates, that work in that are activists on a variety of issues, we are advocating for outcomes that are frankly impossible to achieve because systems are designed to produce the adverse outcomes that they do. And so that work fascinated me. I went and got my public health degree and my medical degree, and really been fighting for folks ever since. And so in 2012, after Sandy Hook, started this group, Doctors Against Gun Violence, and crisscrossed the country fighting for a public health approach to gun violence. And in 2018, when the president was separating children from their parents at the border, I organized one of the country's largest rallies of doctors and scientists to go to the border, to stand with those children, and to stand for their dignity. So I think for me, look, my wife and I are children of immigrants. We're both born here in Texas. We've got 3 young daughters. I'm a primary care physician for the uninsured, and I felt that it was an absolute moral obligation to tell the stories of the people we serve and put these narratives and dignity above partisanship. And that's what's been driving this campaign.
Yeah, and so you said you had a life of public service. What sort of led you to actually run for Congress and add that to your resume?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you that the least important thing was the resume. When the president was elected, in the months after that election, I started seeing children in my clinic, many of whom are Spanish speaking. A lot of the kids I see are children of patients of mine that are DACA recipients or are undocumented. Well over 70 or 80% of our clinics, patients speak Spanish. And in those first few months, these children would come to my clinic, and often their parents wouldn't be there. Their parents were afraid to take public transportation. They were afraid to drive themselves because they were afraid of being deported, of being pulled over and being deported. And the trauma that these children were going through was simply too much to bear. And you take a second and you put yourself in an exam room where you're talking to a mother who's a DACA recipient and a nurse, and the husband is undocumented. They've got 3 young kids, and every day the mom was telling me that she wakes up her 3 children, and they get in a circle and they say prayers because they're not sure if today's going to be the day that one of them will be deported. We are traumatizing children, the federal government is, as a tool to deter immigration to our country. And not only is that a cynical approach to immigration policy, it is downright damaging to the well-being and livelihood of these children. So I was motivated by the experience of my patients, and then simultaneously motivated as being, I mean, you can take it on the podcast, people won't be able to see me, but for folks on video, look at the color of my skin. Look at the color of my daughter's skin. And when the president pushed forth that travel ban, I found myself at the airport behind a microphone. And I said that no president and no party will tell me or my children or children that look like my children that we don't belong here in this country. So if there was ever a time in American history to step forward and to speak about the story of immigrants, the story of what it means to live your life with dignity and respect, this would be the time. And so driven by that desire, the stakes were too high, and we could not afford to lose this seat in 2020. And that's what ultimately pushed me into this race. We have no option to lose the seat. We must win, and that's why I decided to run.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And so you say you work in Austin. I'm assuming you also live here.
I do.
But the district is one of these gerrymandered districts that goes from Austin to basically suburban Harris County. Um, it's currently represented by Michael McCaul, who's one of the, if not the wealthiest member of Congress.
Second wealthiest member of Congress. Yep.
Mhm. Also, the number one water user in the city of Austin. I always like to say that.
That is actually right, and actually responsible over a 2-year period. This was a couple of years ago in Congress. He himself responsible for 1/3 of all stock trades done by members of Congress. You can't even make this up. I mean, he writes his own opposition campaign because of his history and his
Right,
choice.
and that's where I wanted to go next is why Michael McCaul. Now, maybe just because you live in the district, but surely there are some things that he's done in Congress or he's not hearing his constituents say that's kind of driving parts of your campaign narrative. Can you talk a little bit about?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, look, there are very specific issues we can just go down the line on policy, and then I'm going to speak to the larger issue. Let's be quick about the policy areas. Michael McCaul has voted against gun reform a million times while he's been in Congress. We're talking about expanded background checks, closing the gun show loophole, limiting weapons of war on the streets, limiting high capacity magazines. He's been on the wrong side of votes on that issue. Let's look at healthcare reform. Certainly against maintaining the Affordable Care Act, which is a critical lifeline to how Texans, especially because Texas didn't expand Medicaid, how Texans get healthcare. Been on the wrong side of healthcare. Let's look at issues around choice. There's a reason why I'm endorsed by Planned Parenthood. It's because I've always fought for choice and reproductive justice. I'm a call on a regular and routine schedule votes against the interest of people who need access to reproductive choice, to abortion. And so on issue after issue, McCaul has voted against the interests of the community here in the 10th Congressional District. But there's a larger problem here. And the larger problem here is that McCaul just hasn't shown up in the district. You know, he hasn't had a public town hall in a decade. We've had more public events in the last year than he's had in the last 10 years combined. And I think that that is telling, because what people need more than anything else is authenticity in their politicians, right? You need people who understand and who are willing to listen. I always tell people in my clinic that, you know, I don't see Republican sore throats and Democratic sore throats. I see people. I see sore throats. And that resonates with many of the rural folks that I meet in my clinic. It resonates when I'm out in rural communities and I'm talking to conservative voters. Yes, we may disagree on certain policy areas, but overwhelmingly, the voters in the conservative parts of the district know this, that I give a damn about them. I give a damn about their family. I care about the school that their child goes to. I care about the fact that their children should have job opportunities in the region. And you can't have that conversation if you're not there. And McCaul hasn't been there. And I think that's a very clear distinction between Congressman McCaul and the kind of campaign that we're running.
So, and speaking of that, what other issues are you hearing from constituents as you talk to folks, other than, you know, healthcare, because you're a doctor, that's who you're seeing. But what other issues seem to be resonating in the district that McCaul may be ignoring?
Yeah, so obviously jobs and economic opportunity is a big one, right? This district is super diverse. I mean, we've got this tech hub here in Austin. We've got farming and a variety of other sort of small scale industry in the rural part of this district. And then you go due east to Houston, and Houston, you've got energy, right? And so people are rightfully concerned about how we are responding to changing times. Look, 25 to 35% of jobs are going to be fully automated here in the next decade or so. What are we doing to address that? What have we done to build vocational and technical schools in both regions, Houston and Austin and in between, so that people have access to training to prepare for the kind of economy we're going to have tomorrow? Yes, we're moving to renewables, but to do so means that you need a workforce that is skilled and trained to be able to install scrubbers, to be able to electrify the lines. But you got to train folks. And so people are worried about their jobs, are worried about and economic security. So that's one big issue. I think schools is a second big issue, right? This is an issue that unifies, a lot of folks don't often think about it. It unifies Republicans and Democrats, right? Because we care about public schools in our urban areas, Houston and Austin, but in rural areas, the public school is all rural communities have. And so it matters to have resources, highly qualified teachers available. So people care deeply about that. And of course, I know you mentioned healthcare at the beginning. That continues to be a major issue. Rural hospitals are closing. Folks have to drive tons of miles for access to care. You can't afford your medication. You're worried about your pre-existing conditions. We have had so much turbulence in healthcare, and folks are ready for it to just end. Folks need to have guaranteed universal access to care, and this turbulence is too much for people. It's got to stop. I think communities are tired of it. They're tired of the debates in Washington. It has to end.
Mm-hmm. So, and how are you actually, in light of COVID and social distancing, able to run your campaign? How have things changed from the primary to the runoff since this has all happened?
Yeah, I mean, we're living in an entirely different world now, right? We went through a primary where we were crisscrossing the entire district, putting thousands of miles on our cars, which is too bad. You wish that we had high-speed rail in between Houston and Austin. That's a separate conversation entirely.
Mm-hmm.
But look, we had an opportunity to be everywhere, and we have a very active team and a huge coalition of volunteers. And in the days after the primary, we got together with our volunteers and we made a plan to touch every single home in this district. And coronavirus happened. And it changed things in a couple of ways. One, because I still have a day job. I'm still a physician at a community health center that serves the very poor here in Austin and surrounding counties. And so I had to pivot and lean into the work at the health center to make sure that we were ready and prepared. While at the same time, my team, we've got about, I think, 5 or 6 full-time staff, and all of our volunteers have also pivoted. So now we do thousands of phone calls a week in terms of virtual phone banking. We do virtual events. We do virtual block walks. We are still very active in hearing the stories of people. I mean, I think ultimately, look, if I were to take a step back from this entire campaign, all we have done from day one is endeavor to hear the stories of people. And when we hear these stories and we hear these narratives, be able to draw out trends and themes, which we can then put forth policy that can improve the lives of them and their families. And that hasn't stopped in this era of virtual campaigning. I mean, my team they're on the phones every day. I'm on the phones every day. And we're hearing the stories of voters in the district. And so that transition has been, I'm not going to use the word seamless. It's just a different way of hearing people. Instead of having that conversation at the door, you're having that conversation on the phone,
Mm-hmm.
or on Facebook, or on Twitter, or Instagram, or a variety of the other means. I mean, we've noticed that some of our virtual events have been, frankly, more highly attended than some of our in-person events. People are hungry for objectivity and truth in all of the information they're receiving. So we do Sunday town halls on COVID, and very highly attended.
Mm-hmm. And I seem to remember when we were trying to book you a few months back, you were, focused on COVID at that time. And then I understand that you, since everything's starting to open back up and we've had these demonstrations in the streets, you've also maybe offered your services to individuals who might need it, and in that scenario. Is that correct? Or
Yeah, that's right. So I was able to lead at the clinic and be a part of the leadership team that responded to this pandemic, and frankly, be a part of a leadership team nationally that was helping health systems respond. I was proud to be a co-author on an article on health systems reform in the time of COVID that was printed in the New England Journal of Medicine in their Catalyst journal. And I think, again, that just for me is a part of the commitment that I make to share best practices and information so that folks can get the care that they need. But you're right, as the governor has by mandate started to open up the economy, I mean, people are starting to get on with their day-to-day activities. And oh, by the way, we are in the middle of frankly a moment of national awakening and reckoning on the issue of racism against our Black neighbors, family members, colleagues, and communities. So yesterday, I was made aware and reached out to a group of youth in Katy from the Katy School District who had organized to put together an event in solidarity. And they were very committed to doing this in a way that was compatible with social distancing and folks wearing masks. But I worry that when folks are together in that kind of space, that in a day where it's 105 degrees, you need to ensure that there are medics on site. So I went yesterday as a medic and staffed that event, and we handed out hundreds of masks. We responded to a number of calls and just made sure that folks were safe as people exercise their constitutional right to protest.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think is sort of the right balance between opening right now amid COVID, and then, of course, some of the economic concerns that you were expressing earlier that your potential constituents are talking about?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of folks twist themselves into a pretzel trying to figure out how to answer that question. And I'll tell you, quite frankly, we shouldn't have to have this conversation. The reality is that right now, cases are continuing to increase. If you look at a 7-day moving average of hospitalizations related to coronavirus in Houston, those have increased over the last few days. We've had a higher overall number of hospitalizations here in the Austin area over the last 7 days. And so I'm concerned. And the reality is that if we had PPE that was available, we would be able to better protect healthcare workers on the front line. Where all of us in all of our clinics and hospitals are still rationing our use of PPE. We still don't have expansive access to testing. We still don't have comprehensive and coordinated contact tracing. And so all three of those things are barriers to folks, I think, being able to get back to their day-to-day activities with confidence. Mm-hmm. So that balance is difficult. I mean, the answer to me would be to pivot, invest heavily in these three areas. And I believe we'd be able to get back to some normal semblance of economic activity. But until we value those things, until we put money behind those things, it's going to be a long summer. We're going to see increasing cases. I am concerned about it.
And so what do you think Congress should be doing right now? We had the first run of a few $1 trillion of help. And then I think the president actually had a conference today where he touted the unemployment numbers, and basically and Republicans are sharing that as a reason why we don't need more federal action and help for Americans right now. What do you say to that, and what do you offer in response?
The federal government and President Trump has failed the American people. They've failed Texas families, and they've done so because they're sitting here on their high horse touting these economic numbers and these unemployment numbers, when the reality is that it's been big business that has benefited, right? Why the hell is the stock market rallying? S&P 500, Dow Jones, and NASDAQ right now, they're rallying in the midst of historic closures by small businesses, while big business has been able to benefit and leverage this opportunity to grow their market share, right? And so what we're seeing, and I think I read, I don't know where I read this article, maybe it was the Times or the Post, and so folks can do their research and give the credit to whoever wrote it, but I think we're seeing this historic transfer in wealth, yet again, from small business and small business owners to those that are in big business. And so no, I'm not excited about this moment. I think the Republican Party and the president are completely but let's just take a second. Who are the constituents of the Republican Party and the president, right? I mean, it's big business. There's not mom and pop stores in Bastrop or in Belleville or in Northwest Houston and Katy or Tomball or here in East Austin. And so the federal government needs to step forward, provide more economic support to small business owners, provide more flexibility with PPP funds, ensure that with that flexibility, small business owners are able to spend more on their infrastructure and operations, things like rent, for example. I think there's some of that flexibility that's being discussed today, actually, in Congress. But it goes past that as well, right? We've got to be able to support consumers as well in many of these small towns. And the reality is that rent was due a couple of days ago, and many folks have struggled to be able to do that. How do you pay rent and utilities and food all at the same time? You know, for many low-income families, particularly communities of color, study after study shows that that we pay a disproportionately higher rate for utilities, right? The larger proportion of your annual income is spent towards utilities, particularly in the Gulf South, because your home is less likely to be retrofitted for energy efficiency. So these things all work together and conspire together to make it very challenging if you are living at the poverty line, below the poverty line, at 200 or 300% of the poverty line, is difficult. And these communities, our local families here, have not gotten the support that they need.
And so I'm curious, we're about to go back to the polls, and you were just saying how we're not really prepared, and we aren't doing what we need to do as far as testing and providing the right type of PPE for people. What advice are you giving, and would you give to primary voters as they make a choice, since we obviously aren't expanding vote by mail, to make sure that they're safe when they go to the polls?
I'll first say that it's frankly malpractice to not allow Texas voters to vote by mail. And if I was, if the head, if Ken Paxton or whoever in Texas government who has to make decisions on this issue, if they were physicians, they would be up for a malpractice suit and be up before the Texas Medical Board, because to send people in the middle of a pandemic to go vote is a risk to their well-being. It just is. And so let's just say that out front and get that out. It is wrong that we didn't expand vote by mail. It's wrong that every voter in the state of Texas doesn't have a ballot sent to them automatically, but it's consistent with the state GOP goal to disenfranchise as many voters as they can. And it's consistent with a history in the state of Texas of, for example, closing polling locations. And so none of this is new news. That being said, the safest thing for folks to do would be to, one, take advantage of vote by mail if you can. Two, to utilize curbside voting if possible, if your polling location has that. Three, ensure you do early voting. That is perhaps the best thing you can do to avoid crowds. Four, make sure you mask when you enter the building. And make sure you wash your hands before and after you enter and exit the building. I think if you do those things, your relative risk of transmission is low. It's not zero. It's low. It's a shame that folks have to go through this whole thing, but the reality is that we have a duty and an obligation to vote, particularly in the time that we're in now. So I'm certainly not telling people not to vote. It is an absolute duty and obligation to vote. And I think that if you take these precautions, it will certainly lower your overall risk of transmission.
Yeah, I totally agree. I appreciate that. And, your race, I'm not exactly sure where it is on the DCCC's radar, but I know they would love to pick that up. And there's been a few polls coming out really just the last couple of days about how competitive Texas is, parts of Texas, but also statewide. I want to get your final thoughts. I really appreciate you spending this time with us, and I know you're busy and you got a lot of folks to help out there professionally. So any final thoughts and how people get in touch and stay in touch with you?
Sure. Well, look, I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me on. Folks can continue to contact our campaign through our Twitter handle at Pritesh Gandhi, MD, or at our website at gandhifortexas.com. That's an easy way to be in contact with us. But what I'll say is this, is that this is going to be a historic year for this country. This is a time where we will repudiate the policies of a president who has gone unchecked by a host of politicians, including Representative McCaul, who have enabled him, his racist and xenophobic ideology. We have to hold these folks accountable. We are privileged as a campaign to have the support of Planned Parenthood, of the Giffords campaign against gun violence, of multiple members of Congress, and others who believe that the stakes are simply too high to risk this seat this fall. There is one candidate that can put together the coalition that has the volunteers and the resources and this local, statewide, and national support to win this race. That's why I'm in it. Stakes are too high. I wouldn't be in this race if I didn't think that this is what it would take to defeat McCaul. There's too much at risk for our children and for the future of our country. And so I'm very thankful to be on with you all today. I hope that everyone continues to stay safe. Please continue to mask and wash your hands. We are in the middle of a very serious pandemic with rising cases both here in Houston and in Austin. Folks, please be careful and exercise your constitutional right to vote. Early voting starts June 29th with Election Day, July 14th.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much again. Stay safe out there, and we really appreciate it. Appreciate your time.
Happy to be on. Thank you.
Ready for Joe? Is that ironic? Is that ready for yourself?
Yeah, back in 2012 at the convention, they handed those out right before the vice president spoke. So,
Nice.
so yeah, I kept that framed a couple and kept them. Just why not?
Hey, got to be ready.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, I was ready. I'm ready. Here we are. 8 years later, however many years later. Oh my goodness. But yeah. So, and I'm here. I'm ready for you too. We've spoken once already. I've already started recording. So, we spoke once already, and it was the beginning of the pandemic. We had no idea. At least I certainly didn't about what we were about to be subjected to in terms of the shutdown and distancing. We actually met in a bar. You were probably one of the last people I ever went to a bar with. So, so that's just how much things have changed. And so we thought, at the time we tried to right after that interview your opponent, and things had just were gotten too crazy. So we thought we should really do a refresh. So much has changed in the world, and certainly probably the way you've been conducting your campaign. So that's kind of what we wanted to do, is just kind of reevaluate. And so if you don't mind, just kind of give us your elevator pitch. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Right on. Thanks, Joe. I appreciate this second opportunity here. So Mike Siegel, I'm a former public school teacher, civil rights lawyer, and I'm running for Congress to fight for equal opportunity and social justice, and to replace Michael McCaul, who has been a terrible representative for the people of the Texas 10th. My background really has been in public service. I started out after college as a public school teacher. I started out in Houston, Texas, later taught in the schools in California and New York, was active in the Public Teachers Union, and really committed to that fight for equal opportunity and social justice, and the belief that public education is the foundation of our democracy. The idea that no matter who you are, where you're from, if you go to school, you should have opportunity if you work hard, and you should have a place in the society. I later became a civil rights lawyer. I thought that I would be able to effectuate more systemic change. As a teacher, I was involved in a lot of the educational reform struggles, and was even at schools that were closed in some of what's going on in the public education fight, and thought that as a lawyer, I would have this role to be more strategically involved to affect policy. And came back, worked as a civil rights lawyer in private practice, mainly employment law, representing folks who suffered discrimination in the workplace, Asian American professors, an LGBT principal at a public school, whistleblowers, things like that. But also took on pro bono cases, represented protesters, which is appropriate for the moment, and challenged racist police policies. Policies that victimized, especially young Latino youth where I was living. But then more recently became a civil rights lawyer at the city of Austin. I became an assistant city attorney, but did civil rights cases for the city. Basically, the big one was challenging Governor Abbott to fight Senate Bill 4, that hateful anti-immigrant law of 2017. But also the city, fought housing discrimination, trying to protect our source of income ordinance that was encouraging folks to be able to live around the city using government vouchers, challenging bad conditions in apartment complexes, and so forth. And so when I ran for Congress for the first time in 2018, it was building on this service and feeling like the people of the Texas 10th need someone who's going to fight for them. And to me, the key thing has been to build a campaign that shows folks we're going to show up for you wherever you are and fight on the issues that matter most.
And I feel like,
go ahead, please.
Yeah, I feel like you kind of put this race on the map because D-Trip and other folks, Michael McCaul is the second wealthiest member of Congress. He's been there a long time. He probably seems and feels pretty comfortable until you challenged him in 2018 and you got very close. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned from that experience and what you're taking into this new race?
Sure. So it started out, what can I do to support the resistance to Donald Trump? And running for Congress against a guy who co-authored the Muslim ban, presided over family separation as Homeland Security chair, voted to cut our healthcare dozens of times. Seemed like a good use of my background as an organizer. And the assumption is that this was an unwinnable race. And I have to admit that even myself getting into it, this is a guy who had been winning races 20 and 30% and has $300 million in personal wealth. The idea was more to hold him accountable and to run a campaign that could mobilize people, channel all this energy, and knock doors and change what's possible here in the Texas Dems. So we ran a grassroots campaign, less than $500,000 overall, but made hundreds of thousands of voter contacts. And like you said, laid the foundation for what's possible this cycle. The idea for 2020 is to run it back, but to build a bigger and better campaign, more professional, and build a broader coalition. And knowing that it's possible because the viability question has been answered to some extent. In 2018, it was like, well, you seem like a nice guy, but it's not a good investment for my time, for my money. Now it's a national battleground race, so you can get more donors, more organizations involved. And so we basically haven't stopped working. I quit my job in February 2019 so I could do this full time. And we've been organizing, building support among labor unions, all sorts of democratic activist groups, and trying to show leadership on key issues, whether it's voting rights has been a big one for me. Last 2019, we were trying to get rid of this guy, David Whitley, who was trying to purge 95,000 naturalized citizens from the voting rolls. I even became involved in a lawsuit where we're suing the state of Texas to stop the ban on mobile voting, early voting. Recently fighting for universal access to vote by mail. But big picture, taking on these issues through the campaign to show what real representation would look like. Someone who's going to fight for your clean air and clean water, fight for your right to vote, fight to, treat immigrants with human dignity, and many other issues as well.
Mm-hmm. And so, this district runs from Austin to basically suburban Houston. I'm curious, what areas maybe surprised you at the traction that you were getting, and how are you concentrating on those areas and trying to expand that?
Sure. I think, the biggest successes of my campaign last cycle were obviously winning a lot of votes in Travis County by having a really serious field organization, knocking a lot of doors. And then winning support in the rural areas, in particular in Waller County at Prairie View A&M, where basically our work as a campaign fighting for the right of students to vote on campus, they were told on the eve of the election they wouldn't be able to vote on campus. We got involved. My staffer actually got arrested as we were protesting this policy. We were able to really win a lot of support and goodwill in the community. And so that is still there. And, we continue to add to it. Some people say running on policies that I support, like Medicare for all and a Green New Deal, is not good in a district like this. But I haven't found that to be true. That as long as you communicate about these issues in a way that makes sense for folks where they are, like to talk about universal health care in the context of closing rural hospitals, or to talk about a Green New Deal in the context of, well, the fracking interests have taken over the Texas Environmental Commission, which is why you have fracking fluids in your water supply, in Ellinger or Brenham. If you can connect these issues from the local to the national, I found that to be really effective. Now, to win this race, this cycle, we have to win more votes in Harris County. And so it's these neighborhoods in places like Cypress and Tomball, which have become increasingly diverse in recent years. These were previously, you might call them white flight suburbs from Houston. And the Harris County Democratic Party didn't really have a presence there. But now increasingly they do. Beto kind of opened the door. And so there are all these neighborhoods like middle-class folks, Black folks, Latino folks, South Asian folks in Cypress and Katy in particular, who are ready to get out and vote if we go talk to them and let them know why it matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of these areas are really been hurt by Republican policy. So you talked about Medicaid for all, but you have rural hospitals closing and things like that. I know there's a big swath of rural area in the middle of the district. So now that we've been locked down for the last couple of months, how have you been getting your message out? How have you been able to continue campaigning?
It's been multiple iterations, right? We started out, stop knocking doors, even though that was the strength for my campaign, converting to making calls. We've written lots of postcards, I think close to 25,000 as a campaign right now. So we're still contacting voters and bringing volunteers and staff to that effort. But as soon as COVID-19 really hit here, it was like, how can we be of use? How can we serve the people? And the two things we latched onto first were, okay, let's raise money to help food banks. There's a Brenham food bank that we raised some money for. We gathered resources for local food banks. We supported, mutual aid efforts to connect seniors with neighbors in case they need help getting groceries, things like that. And then, taking a step back from that, it's like, okay, the election's coming up, but how are we going to go vote in person? So it's this fight over vote by mail. So I joined with Cheryl Cole, the state rep for part of this district, to urge the Democratic Party. And actually, we got ahead of them and helped them, develop some momentum to file that lawsuit that has gone through permutations, but has actually clarified that we can still all apply to vote by mail if we're in danger of getting sick by voting in person. We each get to make that personal determination. And then another issue after that was like, okay, they're reopening Texas, and this is, later in April, but there's no protections at the job sites for workers. So you're going to lose your unemployment if you don't show up at work, but yet there's no guarantee there's going to be social distancing and PPE when you do come to work. And so joining with unions and other folks to, lobby Congress basically to get some of these measures included with the CARES 2 Act to basically make sure that there's OSHA compliance, that, employers can be held accountable for safety. And now it's like COVID-19, but also racial justice. It's like, how can we support this movement for accountability for police to make sure Black Lives Matter? And that's the latest thing we've been joining as a campaign to support that movement.
Yeah, and I want you to talk a little bit about that and what you've been doing, because what you said in your intro, your basically background has kind of given you the opportunity and tools and knowledge to be able to address these issues. So as a professional who's dealt with this, an attorney, what are some things that you're doing, and what advice are you giving out to organizers and even the city? What can they do to fix this problem?
Right on. Well, so it's many layers. Coming to this as an organizer, as someone who's been a part of racial justice movements as a white person, I bring the experience of like listening first, right? Like, let's take our lead from Black men and Black women who have to live this reality every day, and let's honor their experience and fight in the manner they want to fight. So it's not about getting ahead and showing leadership so much as playing the supportive role and buttressing that movement, and also maybe taking on risks so that other folks don't have to. And so I've been trying to speak out to folks and communicate in a way, because this is a district that is still, I think it's over 70% of the voters are white. And so how do we talk to white Democrats in a way that, kind of pushes folks to be more involved, to not just say, oh, it's on Black folks to stand up for Black lives. No, it's on all of us to reform this broken system. And so one thing I've been doing is telling my personal story, which is that I'm married to a Nigerian woman and have 2 children who are Black, and we're raising them here in Texas. And I actually, my daughter is 8 years old, is a Girl Scout. And when she was selling cookies this spring, she was actually paid for a few boxes of cookies with a counterfeit $20 bill. And if you don't know the story of George Floyd, it's that the shop that he tried to buy some supplies at called it in that there was a forgery in progress, that he had submitted this piece of bad currency, a fake $20 bill. And so I've been telling this story of like, well, my daughter had a counterfeit 20, but if I had gone to the store to pay with that bill, would have I ended up on the street with an officer's knee on my neck? It probably would have been chalked up as a mistake. And
misunderstanding.
To try to help folks get in the mindset of what Black men and women have to deal with in this country. And so that, I feel like that's part of my role as someone who really wants to take risks to push this movement forward for racial justice. Now, I am able to talk about policies. I could talk about the need for a national database for police abuse, to talk about how do we curtail what's known as qualified immunity, which basically gives a lot of police officers immunity even when they do violate your constitutional rights. It gives them kind of a way to escape accountability. To support all these reforms that will help maybe create more accountability for police, maybe allow us to have more trust in police. But also it's connecting it to the story of Texas 10. So there are 2 national stories in Texas 10 that relate to this. One, Waller County, Sandra Bland, that's where she was unconstitutionally arrested, racial profiling, and died in police custody at the Waller County jail because of racist policing. And also Rodney Reed, a man who's been on Texas death row for decades, arrested in Bastrop County in Texas Dems for a crime that most likely was committed by a white former police officer. So it's basically, it's many layered and it's still evolving. You know, what is my role in furthering this work? But, you know, tell personal stories, to help people connect to the issues, and also tell the stories of this district.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that that's evolved because of both the pandemic and the sort of civil unrest around police brutality? You know, I mean, I imagine these weren't the two issues you were talking about before. What are some of the other issues that seem to be raising, you know, getting folks' attention in the district? I guess
That's
you mentioned
right.
a couple: healthcare and
Yeah, I mean, like
Medicare
the
for
first
all.
flyer. Yeah, sorry to jump
No,
in.
no, go ahead, please.
The first flyer produced in this campaign was like Medicare for all, Green New Deal, end the war on drugs, and fight voter suppression. You know, those have actually been the four key issues for me. And then at different moments, it's a different emphasis. And I do think that from the voters' point of view, like the Green New Deal seems like something we get to once we get back to like stability, right? And so I think we really have to acknowledge that we are in a moment of multiple overlapping crises, right? For Black folks in America, it's 401 years since slaves landed on the shores of the United States. And we have this history of slavery, of Jim Crow, of institutional racism. On top of that, you've got the health pandemic, COVID-19, which has disproportionately hit Black folks who are most likely to be essential workers and also most likely to be sick as a result of this. And then you've got an economic crisis, which disproportionately hits folks who are already in a precarious situation economically, which is predominantly, I mean, disproportionately people of color, you know, Latino and Black folks. And then you've got a racist and divisive president. So you've got at least four crises, you know, that are top of mind that are intersecting in this moment. And we can't really privilege one over the other. We have to fight on all fronts. But core message take home for me is that this is the time for progressive politics. This is the time when the Democratic Party needs folks like me, if I can say that, who are willing to speak out on these issues, even though maybe some of the leadership in the Democratic Party is more on the corporate side. Even Joe Biden has never been like a raging progressive. But we need a diverse coalition to let folks know we're going to speak to your issues in 2020, that change really is on the ballot. It can't just be returned to normal, right? That's part of it. We can't have a fascist in the White House. We can't have someone who wants to sick the military on peaceful protesters. But we can't also say to folks, let's just get back to where it was 8 or 12 years ago when it was normal, because for a lot of folks, it wasn't normal. And so to me, you know, I can't just choose one thing, but I think this progressive message really will resonate this cycle. You know, we could talk about Medicare for all because COVID-19 shows how we're only as healthy as our least insured community member. So let's get everybody insured. We need to end the war on drugs because, you know, drug policing hits Black and brown communities disproportionately. Like, we can talk about these things and connect them to the moment we're in right now.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, now that you have the issues, you're out there talking to folks, you were really involved in the vote by mail discussion and voting rights expansion in general. I remember your name coming up as part of some of the lawsuits. But now that we're still sort of in the midst of this pandemic and the runoff is coming up, what is your message to voters about staying safe but still getting out to vote? How is that sort of, how are you navigating that?
Well, we're still pushing vote by mail because the Texas Supreme Court says it's our personal determination. If we feel like it's a risk to our health to vote in person, we can apply for a ballot to vote by mail, and you can still apply today. We still have a couple weeks left. And so we've been pushing that through mail, text, email, letting folks know. Please vote safely.
And nobody from Paxton's office has reached out to you to say you can't do that. I know he's threatened to do that, so I'm curious. You have no issues. I mean, you're a lawyer yourself, so are you just like hoping? Yeah, so,
I wish he would.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
He hasn't, and you know, I've read all these cases, so I stay within the confines. You know, I can't tell you that just because there's a pandemic you can apply.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you that you can make a personal determination based on your health history, based on how clean your voting location is. If you're voting in a supermarket, maybe that's a bigger risk. You can make the determination. But I will share with you that there's plenty of experts who have said this is a health pandemic and it's risky to go out in public. Now, you know, a runoff election is already a low turnout election, as you know, as well as anyone. A runoff election that's been postponed and that's occurring during a health pandemic, this is a really tough sell to get people out. I think a lot of folks are saying, you know what, I'm going to save up until November. That's when I'm going to vote. So we're just encouraging people to vote if they can, if they're willing. And we're going to contact all the people we've already spoken to. We luckily, because I've been doing this for a while, because we had the strong field campaign for the primary, we have a lot of IDs, and we're going to get our folks out. But I think the biggest message for folks is this election really matters. Representation really matters. Michael McCaul won't say a word against Donald Trump on his response to the COVID-19 pandemic. He's going to blame China before he tells Trump, hey, maybe you should be promoting, PPE or making sure our government keeps people safe instead of reopening too early. So I think that case has already been made for us in a lot of ways, how important this election is. But we're just going to keep staying in touch with voters and letting them know how they can vote safely.
Well, I definitely appreciate your time. And, if you have any final thoughts, and you can let our listeners know how they can get in touch with you and find your campaign.
Right on. So Mike Siegel, our website, siegelfortexas.org, SIEGELFORTEXAS.org. We'd love to have you involved. If you'd like to contact voters, we're actually having a big event. I don't know when this is going to air, June 13th. We're going to have an online event this coming weekend. Check us out for that. But let's go win this, y'all. I mean, this is a district that connects Austin to Houston. This should be a Democratic seat. It was gerrymandered to be 60% Republican, but it's not anymore. And the way we're going to beat McCaul, the wealthiest member of Congress, is by getting out, mobilizing our neighbors, letting everyone know that we can win the seat. We can send a terrible Republican home to early retirement. So let's go win this in November, y'all.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Good luck.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate what you're doing.
Appreciate you.